That's a Moneo chair, by the way.
Oh, is it?
He sent me a chair for my birthday. As you do.
It is very nice.
It's a nice chair. It's a little bit heavy.
Well, but I guess everyone has. I think that's. I know it's. Yeah, it is. But no, I think it's perfect.
It's the Jesu chair. It
is quite good.
Yeah, it's from his new church in San Sebastian.
Okay. But I guess I'm trying to remember the when we first met. I just thought it was. Well, I guess I was just really impressed with. Well, I was just really impressed with how much you, know. Like I feel there was so much. Well, I feel like there's a lot of references that are actually like quite like beyond. Let's say aesthetically, what you, let's say the minimalism of Lucky Lane.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I mean, I think coming from a city like Limerick, that is primarily medieval and Georgian, I kind of knew from a very early stage that kind of stripped back economical, translated Georgian that went from London and Edinburgh to Limerick, that it had this kind of sparseness and economy to it that I was really struck by. And it's a subconscious thing in many ways, because I only recently started to kind of work my way back into that. But the other thing from my youth, and not to kind of make it too kind of chronological, but my granny was from East Clare, and she owned the largest house in the village, and it was onto the street. It had no front garden, and people would drive up to the front door, and it was a shop, a general merchant's, a petrol pump, and a farm. And she was the sub-postmistress to this whole town, and she was very secretive, but we knew she knew everybody's business in the town. And I was always fascinated by that kind of sense of urbanity within a very, very small area, as in a little hamlet or village. And I suppose why I'm kind of reminding myself of that in the context of your question about reference and canon, is that I've always found it sometimes quite dangerous to only lean on canon, or what is given to you as good precedent or exemplar work or exemplary work. And I've always enjoyed kind of looking beyond that to kind of life experiences and travel, and obviously things that you kind of have within your own kind of like mindset. And when I always encourage my students to do it, and I think when you're teaching, as you would know yourself, there is a kind of a richness in exchange, and every student, every architect is going to be different. So you can't expect everyone to kind of fit into a little box in many ways. But all that said, having gone to UCD to study architecture, I came out of UCD at a time when postmodernism was at its height, and everything was Aldo Rossi, and all I could see in Aldo Rossi was all of the pitched gable ends and repeated gable ends and all of the motifs. I never really got into his kind of understanding of city until more recently, shall we say. But then having gone through 6 years of architecture in UCD, I was lucky enough to kind of fall into a very good position in O'Donnell and Tuomey for many, many years. And obviously their kind of wealth and canon of their own work, and everything from Sterling to constructivism, which we were talking about before, through to painting to art, the whole thing started to expand and explode in many, many ways in terms of my own kind of like reference. So you were looking at artists all of a sudden as opposed to architects, and I was never that comfortable doing that up to that point. So that was 7.5 years, and then going to Madrid to work for Rafael Moneo was an awesome experience. Wouldn't have been able to do it without the background that I had had in the previous offices, but he opened that up again in the capacity that he has through his theoretical anxieties and design strategies for the 20th century, where he takes an architect's work and fully explores it. Like, you don't get that kind of generosity from many practicing architects nowadays. And I suppose it was through that kind of exposure to somebody who writes as well as practices, and is embedded in a country that has travelled widely, that was an inspiration. So coming back in 2005 from that whole experience, I've always tried to ensure that there's a breadth and width to the work. We didn't want to limit ourselves to only doing one type of work, but to be almost thinking of the common good always and trying to make public work that would be quite large. But I still stand to the early kind of formative years of practice, as in when you're not even an architect and you're beginning to think about the practice of architecture. I always find that really inspiring, and you can kind of see things more and more when you do go back through all of those aspects of what it is to be an architect, because it's an ever-changing career. It's getting more complex, if anything.
I mean, so on one level, of course, as a student or later on also educator, right? I guess it's your responsibility to present a kind of a palette rather than a single kind of vision. And then, of course, the different voices that are of architects that you worked with or for, however we want to put it.
Yeah.
But then of course there are, and I think we can explore that a bit more. For example, I'm really curious about that transition from O'Donnell Tuomey to Moneo and that kind of shift. But maybe that's a question that I'll ask you later. But I guess firstly the question could be, how do you, from all of these influences, how do you distill something so clear and articulate, which can be manifested, let's say, in your house, in Lucky Lane development?
Yeah. I mean, in Lucky Lane, in many ways, rather than look at it as a building, shall we say, I always think of it as garden walls, that it's not immediately Mesian, or it's not immediately minimal in that respect. In some ways it's trying to be very background and laconic. So in some ways, when you look at the plan, you see the outline of the zigzag, and I purposefully made it a zigzag in order to blur that line between whose boundary it is. So it's almost like a walled garden in many respects, a garden within a garden of a former house. And I kind of wanted that dialogue with the returns of both Ockram Street on the one hand, where you get these subordinate forms that come out of the back of the primary buildings, and the same on Carnew Street, the opposing side, where you have single story returns coming out. And I was just interested in that kind of broken relationship, like that kind of edge that is not the formal edge of the front of the house. We were always dealing with backlands. And in some ways that thing of limiting a view or making a kind of a perimeter view, much like Donald Judge or the artist I'm thinking of, the guy James Turrell, there's always that interest in the profile or the lip. And I don't watch television, like this is all kind of personal now, but I wanted to go home and be in a place that I would be calm. That was my primary aim. So in some ways there was a kind of a spiritual kind of seeking out in that kind of first floor room. And that's, I think, what it has become. And it's a sundial to the sun. Like it's responding to the walls of the gardens, but it's also the path of the sun. So in the east, in the morning time, you have a morning terrace. In the evening time, you have a western terrace. And it's just lidded very, very simply and bracketed by these glazed screens. So in some ways, I know you could simply say, well, that looks like Lafayette Park in Detroit by Nice, or that there might be that immediate kind of desire to say, okay, what style is this? But in many ways, when you kind of like, I like to explain it to people that looking at it harder, you can reduce it down to something quite simple. So it's not.
I mean, my first instinct, of course, and it's because I've just been to New York and I went to see lots of Donald Judd, I immediately just felt, oh my God, Judd. Well, he would love this, but also...
Yeah, there is that, but I think when you think about the Dublin's growth over the last number of years, some of the more kind of pertinent kind of residential experiments, shall we say, are always done at small scale. So you've got a lot of very small architects trying to make a mark for themselves, and very often their first mark might be an extension or a muse house. So when you think of Boyd Cody's Alma Lane, or Ger Carty's and Michael Wald's very nice development down in Waterloo Lane, or Simon Walker's a muse house in Ranelagh, and even now to John and Sheila's muse house in Mount Pleasant. There's a kind of a territory of exploration and experimentation with muse houses, and I suppose they offer that space. They don't have a front footpath, they don't have a garden, they have to set up new relationships, and in some ways it's that kind of desire to try and just say something a little bit more special. Now luckily in the case of Lucky Lane it's a whole street, and you only have maybe 3 or 4 teeth at the moment. It's at its infancy, but hopefully we'll have a full set of teeth soon enough, and it'll be a full smile, you know, that there will be a whole kind of new element to Dublin. And I think
because the whole street does have planning.
Yeah, well, interestingly, like when we set out, we knew we weren't going to be able to get permission for 2 to 3 muse houses. So what we did was we had wine and cheese evenings in our house to encourage the neighbours to at least allow us to apply for permission, and we offered them cheap planning permission costs. So we got 10 of them on board overnight, and all of a sudden I was doing a housing scheme as opposed to a house, which meant that the council were looking at this as a coherent response to a problem that they knew they had to solve. They have to get more density into the city. So I think in it being a collective endeavour, not just as a single house just for me, it was able to kind of, I suppose, get over those kinds of fears that the council would have, that you get all of these different types of houses along the way. But I think looking back on it, you know, there's a desire, I suppose, there to think beyond the singular always. You're trying to think maybe in time. You know, you can't just think of one. And even looking at the houses that have been developed there since, without my oversight, they will make something coherent to the end, but it'll take time. But yeah, it's been an interesting process. Trying to convince people that they would live on the first floor and have their bedrooms on the ground floor was a challenge in itself. But you know, good sales.
I mean, it's incredible how well it works.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand. I guess I just can't stop thinking about the kind of monolithic nature of that space, you know. So I don't want to let you off the hook so easily. I mean, I guess in your other work, the work that we've just seen now, it's not always like that. I think there's clearly a response to the site, as you've been saying.
Yeah.
And
I think the desire there to answer maybe your question is to try and make something as elemental as it can be. And going back to Donald Judd and the likes of Tyrrell, who I have great respect for, very often the more simple form and moves can be the most elegant. And I suppose when I was in John and Sheila's, I could see how they were able to grapple with geometry and multiple geometries. And in some cases I was wondering, well, how does one make that mark if you're trying to respond to both context and understand the brief? So yeah, I mean, I think in many respects, like to look at the kitchen even in the house of Lucky Lane, it's a step in section. There's no typical backsplash, it's just all plywood. The counter is plywood, the doors are plywood, and it sets up a kind of a frontispiece for whatever you do in that room. but I kind of wanted it to have that kind of slightly, not ceremonial, maybe that's going too far, but certainly spiritual, where you would be able to come home and you wouldn't have distraction. And it's not about minimalism. I'm not a minimalist, even though I don't have many possessions. I just like the kind of simpler nature of living. And I think when you do become familiar with our work, like the baths, for example, when one goes out there, you can kind of see a desire for simplicity and a desire for it to be almost reticent, that it's not kind of waving, going, look at me. It's more about its reactions to light, to water, to people moving through it, and trying to ensure that it's done in a way that feels comfortable, that it's not going to discommode anyone. So that there is a kind of a natural flow to it, and I do think there is similarities to most of our projects when you whittle it down, and I suppose that's where reference begins to distract me. I like to have reference and look at books, like I read a lot, follow magazines, travel quite extensively, but at the same time I don't have books on my desk when I'm designing something. I don't want any of that distraction. And in some ways it's about distilling and just reducing it down to as fine kind of a crafted space it can be, with the very simple things like light and good materials.
It's interesting looking at the Dan Leary bath.
Yeah.
Because what was interesting when I was kind of preparing for this conversation, I looked at some old photographs of it. Sort of the in a state of presumably disrepair.
Yeah.
But there was also something very poetic about. I mean, it was a site that was used for
many centuries.
Yes, and so there's also some kind of conversation with the history.
Yes, yeah.
And the movement that was already part of the.
Yeah. I mean, when we took on that project, I knew there was an opportunity to think like an archaeologist as much as an architect. So you're working with subtraction as well as addition. Like architects are, I always think, are people who add or who change things, but archaeologists kind of meticulously comb back. And in some ways, when we started the project in Dún Laoghaire, there was an opportunity to, I suppose, uncover and understand, almost like working back a palimpsest, where you were combing and combing. And there are lines within the baths that are formed or are informed by the Napoleonic bastion or the battery that used to be there, to the Victorian baths, to the modern baths before they fell into disrepair. And I was very, very conscious from the start. I remember Sheila O'Donnell saying to me, now, Peter, one of my favourite spaces in Dublin is Dún Laoghaire baths. You better not damage it. And I was like, oh, the pressure. And in some ways it was nice to see her back out there again with colleagues. I think there was a photograph there with herself and Billy Chen, and they were enjoying it. And it's
swimming, I hope.
Swimming, yeah, very much so. But there is that kind of responsibility when it comes to a site that has been there for 400 years, and it's had its many iterations, and you come along with a new iteration. You have to kind of bear in mind that people have memories, and I know we're only kind of short-lived in terms of memory, but you kind of have a responsibility there to ensure that people can kind of see aspects of the site that they may not have been fully aware of. So things like keeping the towel drying room, the kind of building that abuts the baths building, it's kind of like an aberration onto the pavilion itself, but we chose to keep it because it had that direct relationship with the baths, a place of heat and drying, and that's now the sculpture room. To the profile of the wall that brings you to various points that refer to the base layers of the site that we found, and then out into the jetty and the conversation that one might have with the Martello Tower. But the strongest thing about that scheme is the horizon. And like when you go back to Lucky Lane, you don't ever see the horizon. It's kind of completely hidden, and I kind of enjoy that. You make your horizon from the limit. But in such a big site like Dún Laoghaire, where the first line, in many ways, if you were to take the Spare Fen approach, the man and line. It's such a powerful thing, and it's another one of those touchstones in which to refer to. Like I've always been struck in Paul Rudolph's perspectives and drawings that they're really powerfully inclined always towards an horizon line. And not many architects draw horizon lines anymore. But I think in the context of climate change and all of the pressures that we're under, we kind of need to remind ourselves of the much bigger picture. So I always encourage the staff here to kind of try and find the horizon of the site, whether it's beyond the wall or whether it's somewhere conscious.
Whether it's dotted or
that it's there, or to make horizon, or to kind of just give people kind of an aspect that they may not be kind of so familiar with. I mean, the one thing I would say just on the bats, if I may, and again comparing it to Lucky Lane, because you might think that there's a disjuncture there, but when you look to the walls of the site, and they tend to come up as big, kind of hefty walls at points, but when you look to the plan of Dún Laoghaire and the plan of Lucky Lane, there is that kind of play of walls and bracketing and closing, you know, in its kind of morphology. So I kind of enjoy those kinds of distant discussions, and it might be about just making a little corner space or enjoying sitting on a wall top or something like that, but there's a simplicity and a planarity to it that I kind of enjoy. Even though people might see only the kind of the more probably obvious reference.
Sculpted space.
Yeah.
And material there? Like, where did it come from?
The baths?
The baths, the stone.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. Like, it was Gunther Vogt, who is one of the jury members of the AR Public Award. He said, this is a project that's made from water, cement and the gravel of the site. And I was like, that's all you need to say, really. It's an interesting question, Marko. I think the first thing that came to our mind was the resilience of the material needed to be quite present, yet we knew making concrete would be quite brute. And in many respects, people in Ireland, as a young nation, we have challenges when it comes to brute concrete. You know, there's not that many buildings. You take the Berkeley Library as a classic case in point of a building that's much loved, but not everyone would love it. I suppose we had an opportunity to make something that would have a life in itself. So in casting this concrete, we chose to retard all of the vertical or canted surfaces, so you get to expose the aggregates and the sand, the granular within the material, and then the tops of the walls will be polished. So you have this dual life of polishing deeply into the stone, and at the same time a change of angle to become something that's quite porous and can accept the kind of the smaller lives of insects and algae and lichen. So that kind of interested us, and slowly but surely, when we started to develop the kind of the materiality of the scheme, we kind of realised that we could get some of the granite from the Dalkey Quarry, which was the original quarry for the East and West Pier in Dún Laoghaire, which is the largest urban asylum harbour in Europe. It's massive, 330 acres of water. And I suppose we were kind of interested in working with materials that would be as close to the site as we could get, and thinking of carbon footprint, obviously, and all of the kind of like the challenges of needing to be decarbonised. We chose an EcoSem concrete, which was lower to cure. It was a lighter concrete, so there was a kind of a benefit there in having a very kind of light sandy coloured concrete with this lovely sparkle from the granite of the Dalkey quarries. And then inside, to develop that even further, because it goes from a very, very fine concrete down to a very rough concrete down at the jetty. And inside in the pavilion, the first filter or threshold, if you like, we added oyster shell and seashells to the concrete in order to give it even a little bit more vitality. So there is that kind of gradation of, or hierarchy of materials. Even though it is one concrete material, we tried to kind of transform it in some ways as you work your way down to the site. The other obvious kind of comparison that's always drawn with the site, and it was something we were very, very self-conscious of, was obviously Alvaro Siza's baths in Matosinhos.
I'm glad you mentioned it.
And I was looking back on it, and in some ways it's a baths that only has one entrance. Mm-hmm. You're purposefully brought through this beautifully orchestrated space, through these dark caverns of suspended timber, through walls, out into kind of a theatre with the ocean, where you have all these pools and all these rocks that kind of come and collide with one another. But I was kind of thinking, well, should we be comparing ourselves to Alvaro Siza? It is a wonderful scheme and it's a seminal scheme. But in many respects, when you're dealing with a town that needs a beach, you're kind of having to think of multiple paths. Mm-hmm. And when you think about the Dún Laoghaire scheme, it's very much about trying to stretch its way into people's habitual daily lives in terms of routes that they might take, either traversing the site, crossing it. Very often the most beautiful way to engage with the coast is to go out to the sea as opposed to along the sea, because you have the same experience along the sea, but we kind of wanted to offer a few points of traversing. So it's more the kind of the very particularity of Matosinhos, with this kind of very, very kind of Wrightian or Altoan kind of geometry, the 45 to the 90. And we had to deal with like many, many multiple angles. So in some ways I would love to say, okay, it's a brother or a sister to Matosinhos, but the DLR Baths is a little bit more, I suppose, I don't want to say accommodating, because that sounds condescending to our great master Alvaro Siza. It's a little bit more gentle, I think, and until you're there and you kind of walk along it or go through it, do you get the sense that it's a kind of a generous kind of space where you can kind of sit down in as many places as you can.
I mean, it's less instructive.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, very much so.
So how do you then, it's more free.
It is more free, but I think it comes from, I was showing you models earlier, like we chose not to draw the plan for many, many months of the first stage of the project. And it was all models. We only made models, and there was hundreds of models. And the local authority have all of those models, and I've been encouraging them to think about making an exhibition of the models, because you're bending things and you're warping things with the card that you just cannot get with a drawing. And it's both perspectival, it's both ground-based, it's archaeological, and it's architectural in its making. And I think we've always worked like that. Like, we have a whole graveyard of models here that are continuously looked at. Mm-hmm. And I always encourage our clients to just have patience when we're developing the project at the outset, that there is this period where you are testing and thinking about things three-dimensionally. But it does come down to models, and I think that the scheme, as it has kind of come to being or to realization, is that it's very much about the three-dimensional.
Let's talk about this last thing you mentioned about convincing clients that they should kind of not lose faith and just trust you. Yeah. It's interesting that, because it's almost like we need to teach the client to approach this process, a kind of process that probably people do, it's not something that anyone's ever familiar with.
No, you don't do that many times in your life. It's
a funny aspect of the profession. I mean, we don't get taught, no one gets taught that. I think there's an empathy that you have to have with people's aspirations. So when a client or a client body comes to you, like Dún Laoghaire, for case in point, it's a big, broad, complex local authority, and there was probably 5 to 6 departments of that local authority who were dealing in this particular project. And even before we came to the project, there was huge amounts of research done, planning applications done on the site before we got to develop the detailed design and the realization of the project. So in some ways
it's about holding on. Some people kind of compare it to being like a film director, where you hold on to your idea and you have to allow for the team to inform it as you go along. And I always say to...
But you're always also...
you have to push it.
Push back.
But that thing of trust, I often say this out of alarm, that it took me 25 years before we were commissioned with a public project. And I think there's something wrong there, where, you know, your own government will subsidise your education through free third level kind of fees, and yet when you come out of college you're seen as a pariah that nobody can touch until you have built maybe 2 to 3 of a similar kind. So you're kind of continuously trying to find opportunity, and I always like to say to young architects that you're an opportunist and you have to be an optimist all of the time. And in some ways it's about just maintaining a kind of a particular line of inquiry that hopefully your clients will align with. Sometimes it doesn't work out, it's not all ideal, but it's a pleasure when it does occur, and you realise you're enabling something to come into being. But yeah, it can be quite scary.
Well, it's like a click. It's like you click. It's like a relationship.
It is. And at the same time, you can't be their friend. It's sometimes dangerous to become the friend. And I'm always conscious of that, because it's so easy to befriend clients. But in the end... Because
they also see something in an architect. Like they see like, oh, this is a nice person, interesting guy.
Yes. But I think the important thing with architecture is that, you know, when you have an office like we have here, it can't just be down to one person. It needs to be everybody working in concert. And I always say that, like, an office is a community of people, and that everyone has a role to play, whether it's just a simple critique or whether it's kind of a violent change that's required. That's the beauty in many ways of working in concert with others. I think it's very enjoyable.
Yeah, and I guess the removal of ego is key.
Yeah.
Key.
Yeah.
Why is the practice called
A2? Yeah, it's a good question. Well, there was 2 architects originally, myself and Caomhán Murphy. Caomhán went on to other things in 2012, and I maintained the 2 practices, or A2, should I say, the 2 practices. That's a Freudian slip. But I think there's something, and I know this sounds very kind of trite in many respects, but I always enjoyed the size of an A2 page. I never liked A1. And there's something manageable about an A2 page. When you have an A2 page in front of you, it's not intimidating. So I kind of like that comfort. But it is going effectively to 2 architects. I kind of wanted it to be abstract. I didn't want it to have a name like CARROLL Murphy or Peter CARROLL Architects. It immediately becomes too personal.
Yeah. It puts the names at the center. Exactly.
Yeah.
But I did think about the A2 format, which I agree is a human scale.
Yes.
Format of something that is presentable. So it's not A3. It's not A1.
Well, you could stretch it out. Like, people have said to me, like, A2 Brute.
Okay.
Just another turn on it in some respects. But I kind of enjoy the fact that there are many A2s around the world now. Like, we're not the only A2 architects. There's one in Greece, there's one in Manchester, and we're constantly confused with them. I'm not sure. I think it's down to just a very short title. It wasn't about being A to be at the top of the golden pages, the first one you see in the telephone book. There was none of that, even though people thought it was. It's just something very, very simple. And it did take time to kind of say A2 architects to many people on the phone for the first few years, but it's just the nature of it. You know.
I guess the question really is about not using a name and allowing the
freedom
freedom and community to feel more connected.
Yes. Yes.
rather than worshipful.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the genius of MoMA. MoMA.
OMA.
That even though there is a kind of central character, but it's still...
it's a bigger organization.
Yeah. And so I just want to go back before I forget to this transition, and I know this is before your practice, but I just feel it's such an important moment, the transition from O'Donnell Tuomey to Rafael Moneo. I mean, both you spoke about in relation to references and this kind of world of ideas that they generate. What do they have in common?
What do they have in common? Well, I suppose me now. I think...
what was similar?
I think both have a deep interest in city. And I was lucky enough to invite Rafael to Dublin twice. And he came both occasions, but he was in Dublin 2 times before that as well. And I went to see Merida when I was in college, and I was absolutely blown away by it. And not so much the building, but the context, the Roman ruins, the morphology of the city, the relationship between Christian and Muslim. It had everything. It was so dense, and the way he was able to toyfully play with Roman technology and make this opus cementitium construction where the brickwork becomes the formwork. But I suppose coming back to your point, John and Sheila have always had this very meaningful relationship with Dublin in many of their first projects. If you think about the Irish Film Centre, which is now the Irish Film Institute, that was Sheila's and John's first seminal work in the city. And I remember I was in college at the time when they were building it, and it was an extraordinary kind of light bulb moment where you realize people are able to work with the city fabric, that you're not just dealing with a building, but you're actually making permeability, you're bringing people through, you're able to introduce materials where it might not be within the footprint of the building. And I was hooked, and John was my teacher in 5th year. I never had Sheila as a tutor, but I always respected both of them, and they spoke really well. They were very much the kind of the paternal and maternal figures within the School of Architecture, very central, along with Shelley and Yvonne, and indeed Shane de Blackham before them. But I think it was, I had done 7.5 years in John and Sheila's office, and I knew I had to do something different, and I thought of doing a master's in Harvard, and I never really had done beyond level 8, which is where you get to with your BArch from UCD. And I thought, okay, I'll write to Rafael.
Which is 5 years.
5 years, yes. Yeah.
So technically it's a master's level.
Technically, yeah. Well, you could consider it level 9. I would always say it's level 9, but it's officially level 8. But I thought, okay, I will go to Harvard and I will study a master's in design. So I wrote to Rafael, having brought him to Ireland, and he said, well, you should never go and study design. You either go to Harvard and study the history of architecture, or you go and set up your own practice. You're a man of 30 years of age, go set up your own practice. Or if none of those two appeal to you, come and work for me in Madrid. So I was like, I'll just go to Madrid. So I ended up there in Madrid for 3.5 years. But I suppose coming back to the commonality between them, and this is where I note at the outset of the interview where you were asking me, would I said to you, would I have survived that kind of onslaught of work, because I didn't have any Spanish. I had to go and appreciate another culture in many respects. I had to befriend all my new friends. I was living there in the city, and that's what I wanted. So it was a bit of a culture shock, but I brought my modelling skills. I was obsessively making models the whole time in Rafael's office, and going to site as well as project architect, where you were given responsibility to carry out projects. That was all very, very enjoyable. And I suppose it did give me a kind of a sense that you don't have to fear scale anymore. So where you're kind of thinking all the time, should I be doing this? Is it too big? He'd be there working on a skyscraper, or he'd be working on an entire master plan, and I was like, well, if he can do it, we can do it. And it was out of iteration and iteration. I mean, the one common thing again that they had is a desire for lots and lots of overlays and lots of sketches. So the physical drawing and overdrawing, lots of nets, lots of indecision, doubt. Nothing was fixed, and it was always a place of flux. And much like John and Sheila, they would constantly procrastinate over the relationship of one wall to another. Likewise, Moneo would be tearing his hair out in front of you, trying to figure out geometry or a sense of space or how tall something should be. And there was this kind of constant relationship between models that were constantly flowing and drawings, and I just loved that whole world in many ways. And
were there any references that they shared when you went to Moneo? Was there something there that you thought, oh, those two love that?
Well, it's kind of funny to say that they kind of respected each other. So there was always, like, every time I meet Rafael, he's like, how was John and Sheila? How was their work? Are they finished their London School of Economics or now the V&A? And likewise, when I meet John and Sheila, they're saying, well, how was Rafael? And what's he doing? And has he finished the hotel down in Marbella or whatever it is? Or Malaga, excuse me. There is that kind of, I suppose, interest in the work. I mean, I think there are kind of colleagues that they refer to. I mean, it's easy to kind of note with John and Sheila in some ways. I don't want to say easy, that's in no way disrespectful, but like James Sterling is a central character in their world. And right from both of their theses, you could see that Sterling and Wilford, and Sterling and Gowan before Wilford, they are kind of central kind of characters in their work. But they were able to delve back into like the Campus Martius or the Nolly plan. Like all of a sudden you'd have a document about a city in front of you, and it wasn't so much about the building anymore. And there is a very strong kind of interest in cartography in both of their practices. Like when Moneo came to Dublin there recently, he only talked about a spine of projects along the Paseo de Castellano, which is the main route coming through the city, and it followed one of his earliest projects, which was Bank Inter, through to the Thyssen-Bornemisson, to the Prado extension, and then on to Atocha Station. So you have this big kind of long linear spine going through a piece of city, and he was describing both the city and the work. And I think when you think about John and Sheila's work as well, there is a kind of an interest in the making of city. Like if you think about the Ranelagh School, or if you think about the Irish Film Institute, or indeed Sean O'Casey Community Centre down in East Wall, there's a strong desire there to interact and discuss with the city.
And the housing project.
Oh, Timberyard, absolutely. And you go up to the north and you see their Lyric Theatre, which is a masterpiece, and the way it integrates with Ridgeway Street and the banks of the Lagan. It's extraordinarily achieved, you know, and I think you can sense that when you're in the buildings. But they're both able to stand back from their work, and they integrate artists to their work. Like there's a constant interest in art when it comes to O'Donnell and Tuomey and Rafael Moneo. Constant. They're always looking to art, and contemporary artists as well. And I suppose they've kind of instilled that in me in many respects. I have no kind of desire to say that I'm as adept as they are. But I'm interested in that kind of relationship between the visual arts and architecture and the written word, and I think that's important to kind of carry through, because we could very, very easily lose our way in the coming years if we only all focus on climate action in many ways. Like there's a few constants there that we need to be mindful of, that only architects can control. So I think that's an important kind of definition, you know, that there's a strong interest in the core subject of architecture. It's not a very fashionable thing.
Well, that it's in some sense poetry, that we are a poet, an author, an artist, as well as it's an art form as well as other things.
But there's a dignity in the work as well. Like it's hard to say that a building has dignity very often, and I'm referring directly to a comment that Rafael said when he came to Dublin there to give his lecture. He was like, "This is a building with dignity," and I was struck by that. It was like.
And what building was he referring?
He was referring to an extension to Banco de España in Calle Alcalá in Madrid.
To his own.
His own work.
Okay, but that's fine.
But it was a building. No, interestingly, it wasn't his own per se, but it was finishing a corner of a building that had 4 to 5 sides. Very, very interesting urban block, and he got to complete it. And one would expect, like, it was probably one of his most provocative projects that he showed that day. But it was about repairing the block, and one could kind of fear that the temptation would be to replicate or to ape the kind of language of this classical architecture building. And he chose to work with the styles and make them his own. There was certainly no genuflection, but there was a lot of modernity in what he was thinking about. But he was careful enough to kind of talk about the dignity of the building before he came to operate on it. So there's a kind of an understanding there around the city, which is very provocative.
And so, again, the question could be, what did you take from those two in your own practice? But maybe I should actually ask the opposite. What did you not take? It's a more interesting question.
I think the range of work in both practices was quite broad, in that John and Sheila were at a period when I was leaving where they had the Glucksman Gallery, they had housing down in Galbally, they had just been commissioned for the Timberlane, they were doing various competitions. There was a kind of a constant desire to make their own paths in many ways. Nobody was going to tell them how to do it, but they had to make it, and it took a huge amount of effort. To do a competition, an architectural competition, as you will know, is probably one of the most painful things that you can do. It requires a huge amount of stamina and, I suppose, patience. But they were constantly doing that, and you get into this rhythm when you're an employee in an office like that, where you begin to take on the kind of the new. You're no longer fearing what might be. You're kind of working through a process. And with Moneo, likewise, he was constantly doing competitions. Like when I was there, he was a man of 70, and I was like, do I really want to be doing this for the rest of my life? There he was, working in the office in the evening times, never very, very late, but we would all be there working with him on competitions or on projects and striving for something. So I think that has been something that I have learned, that you know, you don't have to fear the unknown in a practice like this, because you're not going to be the same as the practice next door. You have to kind of make your own bed, and in some ways I've kind of begun to enjoy that a lot more, realizing that the people I admire do this as well, you know, that you do work through things.
It's becoming comfortable.
Yeah, comfortable with time, but also comfortable with your way of working. There comes a point in your life when you realize you draw in a particular way and you behave in a particular way. You like to work. It's like reaching a point where you're no longer self-conscious. And I always remember Shelley McNamara saying to us, when you reach the age of 40, you're no longer kind of thinking about what other people think of you. You know, your life has reached a point where, okay, I've got here. Why do I need to bother concerning myself around what others think of you or I? And in some ways that's a great release, because it gives you greater freedom.
Yet you have learned from everybody.
You have learned, yeah, but you also unlearn things by learning. So I don't think it ever stops, shall we say. Like when you've learned something, you can put it away. And sometimes it's the process of unthinking.
Doing things differently.
Doing things differently. But I also think just in my present moment though, like the desire to get more work or the ability to be able to get more work, it's still a very big challenge to be given commissions. Like why is it when you're an architect of 50 years of age as I am, and I'm still having to like really try hard to get substantial commissions? And I'm not saying that they should be walking through the door. What we have consciously tried to do over the last 10 years is to eke out collaboration, whether it's with a much larger local authority or a practice like Allies and Morrison in London. The opportunity that one is exposed to by arming yourself with others is phenomenal, and there's an awful lot to be learned from that, because it's again adding to your nomenclature or your reference. And I always enjoy that, because you're no longer necessarily the only boss in some ways, and it again breaks from that thing of having an ego about your own project.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, it's a further project of relinquishing ego.
Yeah, very much so. So.
So that seems to be really an important thing for someone, for a young architect to learn.
It is, yeah. But at times the way the studio projects are sometimes set up, though, that it's not always that easy to get them on that track. But certainly in the university in Limerick, where I've been teaching now for 18 years, there is a desire for students to become a little bit more like agents, that they have greater agency, and that they go out and they meet stakeholders in projects, that they're not given a brief and they're told, this is your site, go and do something, but that they have to interact in a more interesting way, perhaps, or a more explorative way. So I always kind of embed in my kind of students' module descriptors that they have to be aware of their own agency. I think it's really important, and somehow then they're a lot more comfortable in their skin, and they're aware of what they can do and what they can't.
I mean, one thing I often think is that when projects, that there almost has to be a little bit of an illusion that a project is not a student project.
Yeah.
For them to feel the impact of it, to feel that agency. I mean, I don't have the answers to how to achieve that, or how to make a student feel like this isn't just a student project, but it's actually a project. Because every architectural project is a project.
It is, yeah.
I mean, every project, every build project was was at the same level of a student project at some stage.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think like when you think about Shane de Blockham, if we can speak about that man for a moment, the fact that he has been such a central character in Irish architectural education for so many years, and at the same time has nurtured an incredible career with incredible commissions, with a consistency and a clarity, and I think that kind of culture cannot be kind of like lost, I suppose, or it cannot be set aside. A school is a school, but you also have characters there that might both be teaching and practicing. I mean, I always think it's really healthy for a school of architecture to have practitioners that are at the coalface in many respects. And I find that inspiring, and particularly inspiring when you're shocked to realise that these architects might not always just talk about buildings, but they might talk about a painting, or they might talk about a play, or they might be sports people. You know, just that kind of sense of life, but also discipline in what a project is. And
there might be a spiritual teacher.
A spiritual teacher, yeah. Well, in many respects, we're all pastoral care people as teachers. Like you get to know your students so well.
Well, I'm thinking about one person.
All right.
Mary.
Oh, Mary, yes.
I mean, I guess spiritual maybe is a bit of a push, but I think absolutely.
No, but she probably needed that in her life. I mean, she halted her career as an architect to kind of develop her Zen capacity. But yet, when you speak to her, she has incredible judgment. Fascinating kind of interest in many of the contemporary issues that I'm always surprised by. She talks about biodiversity, or she talks about materials in a very particular way, or language, and I think that's like both fascinating and reassuring that you can go forward and you're constantly a student in many respects.
So the Venice Biennale pavilion.
Yes.
That had quite a few voices. How did that come about? And I mean, we don't need to kind of talk about how the group became a group.
Yeah.
We don't need to talk about that, but I'm just curious about the different voices. I mean, I know you and I've met Mary. So those two are, I feel, well, I understand. I know what the voices are, but I just wonder, how does it work?
Well, we're all practitioners, we're all teachers, we all have a strong connection to Ireland, and we're all at a point in our careers where the profession of architecture is needing to be recalibrated. That in itself was kind of interesting, that the ages were different. We're kind of keen to have diversity across the group, and I hope that played out. But it was just finding a kind of a group of people that everyone kind of consensually enjoyed being with one another. Like, 'cause it was very much a process.
That's so important.
Yeah. Like we didn't have a set idea when we were commissioned as to what the installation should be, and we wanted it to be a process, and it's still a process. It's ongoing. It's not in any way finished, and in some ways we kind of wanted to kind of put things like language, song, geology, botany, economy, many things that are outside of architecture but influence architecture. And while you might think it's a romantic idea to look back and look at a title like In Search of High Brazil, it's a fantasy island, but in many ways we're looking at the island of Ireland in that. It's not just about the 20 or so islands or the 3 principal islands that we focused on, Skellig Vihil, Ilan Clara and Inishman. It's very much about looking at ourselves and saying, okay, we're at a crisis point. We need to get closer to nature, and we need to use language more carefully. We need to think about construction more carefully, and how we do that is by resetting our relationship to simple things like the diurnal cycle, day to night, the seasonal cycle, winds, flows, tides, how flora and fauna live on our planet compared to ourselves. All of those kind of things come into play in many respects. And we didn't have a unified voice. Like, you ask Peter one question, you ask Elizabeth another question, Mary another question. There wouldn't always be a kind of a shared opinion. But what was very, very interesting about the thing was we were all interested in where the process might bring us. And the installation, in many respects, is a kind of a microcosm of a much larger body of research that we did. And in Venice, you have to be, I suppose, aware of the people who might want the 5-second pass through your installation, or those who might want to spend 50 seconds, or the ones who might want to spend 5 minutes, or the ones who want to spend 50 minutes. So we chose to slow everything down. We wanted lots of CSACs, we wanted a film, we wanted a soundscape in the room, we wanted it to be immediately haptic. We didn't want it to be explained. There's no labels on all the pieces. It's very much left to your own imagination. So in many respects, it's quite open-ended, and I think we enjoy where it's got to. I mean, it's going to inform our practice, no doubt, going forward, in every respect. But these kinds of things are things you do not almost on the side, but you have to continue your practice, you have to continue your teaching, and yet you're doing these installations. It's one of those multiple juggling jobs that you get, but it gives you a greater scope, certainly. It opened up our network significantly.
I mean, it's a massive job.
It is, oh yeah.
In a short period of time.
Yeah, and then you come back and you have to show it around Ireland for a year. So there's a national tour involved as well. No mean feat.
Well, I guess it was something. I guess just a tiny bit more on that. The theme, of course, is at the center of the theme is a fictional island.
Yeah, well, take a step back from the theme that we brought to it. Like what made us think about In Search of High Brazil was certainly Leslie Loco's kind of theme of decarbonisation and decolonisation under the rubric of laboratory for the future. So in taking those two things, laboratory of the future, decolonisation, decarbonisation, how are we as practicing architects going to inform an architectural culture in Ireland and abroad with what we know? So in thinking about that,
and I guess what we have, what's on the ground.
Correct, correct, yeah. And like we knew we wanted to make something that would be quite light, that would be transportable, that would be economical, that could be recycled. Everything is recyclable. And it's not just about greenwashing. It was kind of consciously thinking about, okay, where can we get the rope for the sea sacks from the sea? It's all floating. It's waste. Sheep's wool, the big mound in the centre of the room that makes this abstract Skellig Vihil, that's undervalued. It has no value in Ireland. They throw it out. They put it under apple trees. Nobody uses it as insulation. It's just thrown out. Like you can buy bags and bags and bags of wool for €5 to €10. Nothing. It has no value. And we were quite surprised by that. And then there's things like the fragility of paper. We made a beautiful drawing of the Pangaea, the world as an island, before it split into its kind of continents. You have the Panthalassa Sea and then the Pangaea continent. And it kind of, while it's drawn on a vellum paper, it reacts to the room, it reacts to humidity, to light. It has this kind of transformed kind of quality when you put it in a space like the Corderie. And there were things like that
it's always the same drawing.
It's the same drawing, yeah. It's just one drawing. It's there for 6 months. And it kind of warped and wefted a little bit. You know, it was kind of like slightly saggy, which we kind of enjoyed. But in saying that, coming back to why the theme In Search of, we're obviously seeking something. High Brazil is a fictional island in the west of Ireland that appears and disappears every 7 years, and it's recorded and known that people have been to this island, like Thomas Westrop, the great traveller and writer. And there are other people like Stefan Frenkel, who made the sea sacks for us. He is convinced that he has seen it, and you have to believe these people. And I think what's so nice about the imagination in that respect is that we need to value our imagination a little bit more, because when you take narrative and myth out of the equation, like where do you get your meaning from? In many respects, you need stories and your own story as part of that equation. And I think there's something very powerful about that in the context of High Brazil being potentially the island of Ireland, that you're looking to all of these things being specific to these peripheral kind of islands on the edge of Ireland, yet they're at the centre of the world because they're on the edge of the biggest motorway in the world, the sea. And what we were trying to do was encourage people to look from the sea into the land as opposed to the land out to the islands, and kind of reverse that. But the other provocative thing I would say about the installation, again, was that we purposefully chose to do the installation in Italian and Irish only. And we eschewed the more technocratic English language for reasons, I suppose, around the aims of the curator, Leslie Loco. And it caused quite a stir. I expected to go to the Venice Biennale and hear 200 different African languages being spoken within the corderie, going from room to room to room. But there was this evidence of English everywhere you went. And I just felt that there was a kind of, I suppose, a lack of faith there in kind of really taking on decolonization. No disrespect to the curator. I think Leslie Loco did an amazing job. It's just, it feels like it could have been more provocative in many ways by challenging the primacy, I suppose, of English in our lives. Because we have 10 more words in Irish for everything that is said in English. So there's words that just don't exist in English that we have in Irish.
But maybe also just the trust that we will actually understand languages even if we don't know them.
Yes.
You know, Chomsky always says, when he explains the theory of universal grammar, which is his primary job, he's a linguist.
Yeah.
He says that his theory is kind of rooted in this idea that if an alien was to come to the planet Earth, a Martian, and if they're to hear all the world's languages, they would to them sound as one language.
It's true.
And I just love that there is something that unifies everything and everyone in language.
That's right. But even without the need for language, like, we had the most amazing interaction with a group of Nigerian farmers who came to the Biennale, and they immediately sensed that this was about the land. And even though we couldn't talk to one another, they were just kind of like really interested in this thing. Now, they had small, limited amounts of English, but at the same time I found that very, very powerful, that you don't necessarily need the language. You might hear the soundscape and you might kind of try to ponder and understand what exactly it is that's being said. But you're right, you can begin to understand with time. And I think patience, and one of the things I suppose we learned as architects is that you need to be possibly more aware of the less tacit things, like spoken word, the non-physical, in when you're thinking about a context. It's really, really important. And certainly it's been embedded into all of our student work since.
Well, I think we're taught, and we're kind of so focused on transmitting information, you know? I'm just thinking of all the disclaimers I've written on drawings and all the kind of level of explanation, so we make sure we've covered our ground, and that, you know, there's no room for misunderstanding that this pipe is, you know, here or there, and that somehow translates to when we try to do an exhibition, where that maybe is not necessarily the point. Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, artists just put piece of work in the space. I mean, the explanation, there might be an explanation, but it's not really central.
Yes. Well, I think the frustration of some of the visitors to the Biennale a year ago was that there wasn't any drawings, or there wasn't any obvious architectural installations, that it was trying to capture something perhaps a little bit bigger, that it was an environmental concern. It might be about mines. I'm thinking of Heidi Lowensen's work, or painters from Africa who are interested in looking at song lines. But there was an extraordinary almost, how would I say, accordance. Like if I think about the Australian pavilion where they were looking at unsettling Queenstown, and it was in the island of Tasmania on the other side of the world, and they were talking about the colonizer and the damage that the colonizer did to that landscape and the beauty of that land. We could kind of see kind of a dialogue there, and there was definitely moments of, hang on, that sounds so familiar in many respects. And I think there is a shared story that is there, even though they might be in completely different contexts, and not necessarily about colonization or otherwise, but just an awareness of nature and a kind of a need to probably bring greater presence of that into your own process, I suppose, as an architect or as a teacher.
And so though that was kind of a nice thing, it meant that it was research heavy, or was it?
There was.
Or
research.
was it too kind of or too difficult to grasp?
No. I mean, yeah, and it's a good question, because we realised, okay, how are we going to tackle all of these questions that are out there at the moment? And we chose to start our whole process by doing briefing sessions. So we would invite 5 different voices to a session every week for the first 12 weeks, and it was like an online kind of briefing session where we would have a farmer or a fisherman with an economist mixed together, and they would talk across one another, and they all came away totally refreshed and totally blown by the discussion that was had. And they were generally themed around landscape and memory. Linguistic contours was another. Minding the earth, economy, lots of kind of big subjects, but we kind of chaired the discussions and invited them all to kind of come in, and almost naturally the conversation began to flow. So those kinds of
and they were building each other.
They were building each other. Oh yeah, very much so. But what was nice about it was that there was a kind of a process embedded in kind of finding out things. Like, we only touched on the very, very top skin of it. We could delve right down deep into it. But what was fascinating about it was just the community of people that are out there that might be thinking about the same thing, but don't necessarily. So a case in point being,
don't talk to each other.
They don't talk to one another. Like we had this economist from PricewaterhouseCoopers who is responsible as a consultant to the government to put as many wind farms out into the Irish exclusive economic zone. But he was able to tell us the size of the area, but we were like, well, what does that look like? What do all these windmills look like? And he was like, I don't know. And we were like, what do you mean you don't know? There's no spatial consequence in many ways. Understanding. And I suppose that generated an interest in him. He was like, well, maybe I do need an architect, and maybe I do need to model these things and draw them in a particular way that would show me 400 hectares of floating wind farms out in the middle of the ocean. So we kind of enjoyed those realizations.
I mean, there were things that I would have asked, but I don't think I need to ask, because I think we've covered them. Like, you've actually spoken about things that I really would like to talk about.
Yes.
So that's nice when that happens.
Yeah.
And you don't even know that you don't even know, that's interesting. You don't even know that you've answered my question. You know? I've never thought about that, actually.
I mean, I suppose I would never be conscious about the work that we do. Like, I know there are practitioners, they're very aware of their position within almost society. And I feel that they're a lot more, I don't want to say cunning, I don't think that's right. It's more...
Well, more PR focused.
More maybe PR focused perhaps, but I always kind of want to kind of get my hands dirty a little bit and not to be too precise or careful about what it is. Like, you have to...
Oh, no, absolutely. No.
You know.
But I think that's beautiful that we actually, the 2 central projects that we talked about, the baths and
the
house.
Yes. That was an interesting pairing, because I wasn't even thinking myself. Yeah. Well,
because they're different, you know. One is a sculpture, the other one is really. It's not well. I guess it is sculpture in Juddian sense, but the other one is sculpture in a more of a.
I go out to the bats and I see sculpture and I see form and I. Yeah.
Well, it's also the nature of the material. Concrete is formed.
It is.
It's molded.
Yeah. But the thing about the bats, like there's a beautiful print from 1851 in the National Library of Ireland that has in the foreground a quarry with all these massive blocks of granite, and then in the middle ground you have the East Pier, and then in the background you have Howth. So you have immediately these three scales presented, and they're all talking to one another. And there's this kind of relational reflux between all of those three things that I've been really enjoying in the project. So when you see all these kind of like funny shapes or angles in the concrete, I always kind of try and bring it back to, well, it's actually meant to be elemental in some ways.